Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, this is Ray Gerard. Welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. This is the program that imagines what if St. Paul were alive today? What if, looking at what is happening in our country today, he could write a letter to America? What would he tell us? Well, here on this program, we give you precisely such a letter. We then use that letter for a discussion. We use the letter to help us in discussing an issue that is current in our lives and our society today. We look at it through the eyes of St. Paul. And as we discuss these matters, we always bear a motto in mind: love and kindness through the light of truth. And hopefully that is what we do here. Now today, we're going to talk about an issue that recently came into the news. And before I go any farther, I want to introduce a guest on the program here today, a friend of mine. His name is Bob Hennekeys. Bob is in the diaconate program here in the Archdiocese of St. Louis. So, Bob, welcome to our show.
Good morning, Ray. It's good to be here.
So, anyways, what we're going to talk about today is, like I said, a story that made its way into the news, and it concerns some children at a school in Ohio. And it seems that there's a child, these are sixth grade children, and it seems that there's a boy in that class who has now identified himself as a girl. And he has asked people to call him, a girl. And it seems that there was an art class where there were three girls who, from week to week, would talk about this situation. And they were actually pretty excited about it. They would talk about how this boy was going to be taking girl hormones, how he was actually going to have his male parts removed, and that this was good. This was going to make him a girl. Well, after a couple of weeks of this, there was a boy sitting at another table who spoke up, and he said, no, he is a boy and not a girl. And there were two other boys at his table who agreed. Well, there was a teacher who was nearby, and she reported this to the assistant principal. And she reported the incident, or these boys, as people who were engaged in bullying. Anyways, the first child who spoke up was called into the assistant principal's office. He was told, no, you can't do this. You must refer to him as a girl. As a matter of fact, before this had occurred, the school had made it known to all the children in the school that with regard to this situation of this boy who was self-identifying as a girl, that in fact he was a girl, and that the school proclaimed that he is a girl, and that people must refer to him that way. So now, after these children had failed to abide by that, the assistant principal, in discussing this matter with the first boy that we talked about, who said no, he's a boy, the principal told this child that there might be consequences unless he basically, abided by the school's policy on this. Well, later on, an hour or two later, the child was in a physical education class, and he was pulled out. And he, of course, felt a certain amount of shame and humiliation. He was being punished, and he was being punished for expressing his opinion. The other two boys who expressed similar opinions suffered a worse fate. Apparently, they had some type of out-of-school suspension. So I don't know how long they were prevented from going to school or what the nature of that was, but they were apparently punished even more so than this one particular boy. Well, in any event, the assistant principal then proceeded to call the child's mother and explain why the child was being punished. Well, the mother didn't agree to this, and she ended up contacting some lawyers who were specialists in constitutional law. They wrote a letter to the school, and the school actually backed down on this, and for good reason, which we'll get into. But before we do that, we're going to consider a letter of St. Paul. And this is actually from his second letter to Timothy. And he said, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who will judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingly power, proclaim the word. Be persistent whether it is convenient or inconvenient. Convince, reprimand, encourage through all patience and teaching. For the time will come when people will not tolerate sound doctrine, but following their own desires and insatiable curiosity will accumulate teachers who will stop listening to the truth and will be diverted to myths. But you, be self-possessed in all circumstances. Put up with hardship. Perform the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. Now, Bob, I don't know how that strikes you, but as I reflect on that, Paul has in mind a truth, an eternal truth. He, of course, had a dramatic revelation of Christ. That is his background. That is the perspective that he's coming from. And I just can't help imagining, what would he think? What would he be telling America today if he sees schools, in wholesale fashion, telling children they can deny, how they were created, by God?
Yeah, I think, Ray, that what he would be telling them is, first of all, he would say there is a truth. God presented a truth, and there is a yes or no. And while we in the United States have the wonderful capability to constantly vote and make our decisions on how we run our country by a democracy, truth is not a democratic. There is a real truth. And the real truth is that God loves all of the children in this story. He loves them with all his heart. He has love and compassion for each one of these individuals. But there is a truth that a little boy is born as a little boy. A little girl is born as a little girl. And that's who they are. Now, we as human beings, we get confused. Our minds are not always where they should be. And if I tomorrow proclaimed I'm a monkey, I could do a lot of things, but I'm not going to be a monkey. I love my dog. I have a beautiful Labrador rescue, and she's wonderful. And we play, and she'll sit at my feet, and I'll pet her head as I'm working or maybe even watching a ball game. But under no circumstances, even if I wanted to, could I ever say I'm a dog. I might think that because she's such a wonderful, loving animal, and I'd like to do that, but I will never be a dog. God has given us that truth, and each of us has to understand that. And while we constantly want other things, right? We sometimes, for myself, I might want more money or more food or more other things. Well, I want that with all my heart and soul. That isn't the truth. And therefore, I think St. Paul would say, I love you to each of these children. He would say, I want you to continue to search for that truth. And he would say, please, let us get this right. Let us make sure that we understand that God is the truth, the only truth, and that you can't change from being a boy to a girl. You were given certain genitalia, certain parts, certain hormones. That's who you are. And even if we desire, we couldn't do that. But you don't tell this little boy that's confused that you are doing something horribly wrong. You say, I love you, you're confused, and we'd like to help you understand why you're a little boy, that you're not going to make that conversion. Even if with surgery and hormones, you are not going to make that conversion.
So, this reading from St. Paul, he talks about people being diverted to myths. I mean, how is this anything else than a myth? So the question is, it's a myth that is obvious. For example, to this sixth grade boy, he's stating what is obvious to anybody with a pair of eyes. No, he's not a girl. He's a boy. So the question is, why? Why are we interested in saying something, believing something that, to just our basic common sense does not make sense? And that's actually what we're going to explore in the program. So here's another element from this letter from St. Paul. He talks about people being self-possessed. Self-possessed. What's he talking about?
Well, to me, someone is self-possessed when they go ahead and want what they want only and not to others. It actually is the root of hatred and difficulties when you think your belief is absolutely more important than anything else in the world, and it is all about you, that I can do anything. And obviously that's not correct. We might like to believe that because we're in the U.S. and you think that you can do anything. Every one of us can grow up to be president. Every one of us can make a fortune. Every one of us has those opportunities, but not anything goes. And when what we want becomes so much more important, it overrides the truth, then we are self-possessed. We think we are more important than God, than God's truth, our Creator, and the one who made us. And that's a huge mistake. I want to spend my time worshiping this leader, not trying to decide what his truth should or should not be.
Well, I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle on that. What you're saying is right, in that when people get self-possessed to maybe an excessive degree, I think that's what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But, in this particular reading, he says, be self-possessed in all circumstances, put up with hardship. So I think what he's saying is control yourself. If you encounter hostility, animosity, opposition to, your proclamation of the truth, if you're standing up for Christ and you encounter difficulty, be self-possessed. Don't, respond in kind to any kind of hostility. But control yourself. Now, what does that mean? What does that entail? I mean, that entails a continuing belief. You don't succumb to the opposition. You still believe the good news, the gospel, but you don't respond in kind. Well, the only way you can maintain that kind of mentality is if you maintain your belief. You do not succumb to the pressures of the current culture. He says, put up with hardship and then perform the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. And this little 6-year-old boy, this 6th grade boy does not need to hear that because he's doing that. But it's the adults around him who need to hear that. And, what I like about St. Paul is when you look at these readings, what you can do is you can find evidence for something that we've been told. We've been told that our culture and our society in America has been based on the Judeo-Christian tradition. I find it here. I find it in this letter. Paul says, put up with hardship, perform the work of an evangelist. As I say, to me, what that means is hold on to your beliefs. And so you don't succumb to the culture. You don't become part of this collective group mentality. You maintain your individuality. And the entire Bill of Rights to our Constitution, the underpinnings, one of the foundational documents that define who we are as a nation is based on the protection of the individual. What Paul is saying here, what we have in our system of government, they express this same belief. And the question I raised a minute ago is, well, why are people wanting to impose this certain mentality even on 6th grade children? And I think it's because, as we'll get into that, it's a denial of this idea, this Judeo-Christian idea of respect for the individual. Each person is created in the image of God. It's, there's a value to the individual. So anyways, and it's that value that has been recognized by our Supreme Court. And a matter of fact, it's been recognized over and over again. And just to get out of the way, the constitutional analysis of this, because, hey, that's who I am. I'm a lawyer by background and training. So in any event, you have to, like I said, this mother of this boy who was punished contacted some constitutional lawyers who specialize in constitutional law. And they provide this kind of work, on a pro bono basis. And they wrote a letter to the school. And they plainly told the school, here in this country, still today, what you are doing is very wrong. They actually are the ones who are, what's really funny about this, Bob, the school is the one doing the bullying.
Yep, absolutely. They're telling this young boy what it is he can and can't believe. When he sees with his eyes exactly what's correct. All of us see that. And they're telling him, this is going to be your belief, and if you do not believe that, you will be punished for doing so. That's the ultimate in bullying and telling him what he's going to do.
So what the lawyers, they referred to, just by way of background, I'll just take a second on this, but the reason why the school backed down is because the attorneys referred to a case known as the Tinker case, which goes back to 1969. And in that case, the Supreme Court proclaimed that students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. Schools have a right to impose discipline. If someone says, I have the right to free speech, and I'm going to say these horrible, obnoxious, provocative things that'll cause all kinds of turmoil in the school can rightly stand up and say, no, we've got rules against that. But if something does not rise to that level, and it's just an expression of an opinion, then the school is bound by the principle that students, just because they walk through the gate of the schoolhouse, don't lose the same constitutional right that everybody else has to free expression and express their opinions. And it's just crazy to me that here you've got a little boy and he's being punished for expressing an opinion that anybody, who just, believes their eyes and does not get sucked in with, the narrative that, the culture is preaching. He's just expressing what anybody like that would say.
The wonderful thing about children that are 11 years old or so, which is a sixth grader, is they have the capability to see what is real and to express that. And they have not been pushed away. Now, they still have the capability to lie, to make those changes. But the vast majority of the time, they are simply speaking the truth, and they will tell you what they're thinking. And it is a wonderful age. It's a great time to watch children. They're at a good age for truth and telling you what they really think is there.
So, looking into this a little bit, just poking around on the internet, found a couple of stories. One was written by a woman named Barbara Kay, a professor up at a university in Toronto. Toronto, but in Canada. Anyways, so she wrote a piece, and in this piece, it was in something called nationalpost.com, Barbara Kay, When Gender Identity Education and Theory Goes Wrong. Anyways, she recites a story about a woman who had a boy in school, and so this boy was perfectly normal, perfectly, he didn't express any what's called gender dysphoria. He didn't, on his own come up with some idea. He expressed no symptoms of having problems with his sexual identity. But at the school, he was told girls are not real, and boys are. Bob's making a face at me, but he was told girls are not real, boys are not real. Now, excuse me, Paul's talking about a myth. That sounds like myth speak.
That's a myth if I've ever heard anything.
And so all of a sudden, this boy starts to have difficulties. He's got fears. He's got mental anxiety. So they take the boy. Eventually, they move the boy to a different school, and the boy recovers. But in any event, along the way, I think he needed to see. Then there's another person who wrote to this Barbara Kay apparently and told the story of her son, and her son had similar problems, and so they went to see out of the blue. This boy comes home and tells his mother. He all of a sudden out of the blue, like just very dramatic. He announces that he's a pansexual and a demigirl. Can you imagine your kid coming home from school, telling, "Hey, Mom, I'm a demigirl"?
The first thing I'd have to do is pull out a dictionary and understand what that means. I know boy and girl, but I don't know what pansexual means. I'd struggle with that.
So they take the boy to see a therapist. And you know what the pet therapist tells him? You were the seventh group of parents that have come to me from that same school.
Oh, my. Oh, my.
So what are we doing to our children? What are we doing to our children? Anyways, there are more stories out there. The Sunday Times up in Canada had a story about an investigation being done by the newspaper that found out that almost 90% of reported sexual assaults, harassments, and voyeurism in swimming pool and sports changing rooms that, these happen in unisex facilities. These types of facilities make up more than half the total, and yet 90% of these sexual assaults. There's another incident where there's a guy, this is in England. It was a guy. He was born Stephen Wood. He changed his name to Karen White. Now, he changed his name. And a lot of these cases involve people who self-identify, to use the vernacular.
Right.
But they're, they don't necessarily go through any surgical changes as yet, but they simply just self-identify. Okay, fine. And the culture says we must respect that. So he was born Stephen Wood. He called himself Karen White. Again, physically, he's male, has male attributes, but he calls himself Karen White. Okay, fine. Well, he had served 18 months for sexual abuse of a child. And he was on remand, apparently, for 3 rapes committed as a man. But he identified, as I say, as a woman. So while he was in jail, he was housed in a woman's prison. Here's a guy with a background of assaults and rapes and abuse, but he's calling himself a woman, so where did they put him?
With the women.
With the women. And guess what happens? Within days, he had assaulted 4 women. What are we doing? We've concocted a narrative. We're following it. We're harming the children. We're sending children to therapists. Right? The society is housing a guy with women who we're putting people in positions where they then harm other people. What are we doing? It just doesn't make sense.
Well, it seems crazy to me, Ray. And one of the things I can't help think about as we're going through this is, I'm old as dirt, and so I don't.
So am I.
So I don't remember 11 years old, but if I do remember much of it, and I certainly remember as my children went through that time frame, it's all confusing, right? They're starting to feel feelings they've never felt before. Wonderful things that God put in us as we make that transition from child to adult, and they're beginning to go through those, but they've never felt them before. And then we add to all of that this insane confusion to these children who can't just simply realize that this is a difference and go through that in a reasonable way. Instead, we're tossing in the confusion that they may or may not be the actual sex that they were born. How much tougher does that make that on a child that is feeling these intimate new feelings for the first time in their life, and somebody's telling them they may be something completely different? We've got to get down to the point where we love them and help them understand that these feelings are real, that these feelings actually, that they're having those, that's a normal thing, a normal process to go through, and to sort of sort that out and understand it for a period of time. How could we tell someone, well, those feelings tell you that you're another sex if that's what you want to be? We need to help them understand who they are and why those differences are occurring. It's just crazy to not help them through that very, very difficult time that they go through for the first time in their lives.
What you're talking about, is how do you help the people who have genuine, what the scientists call gender dysphoria? They have real confusion, real doubts. And you're suggesting that we help them instead of just simply acknowledging this is fine, this is good, but counsel them, help them with their confusion. But we're not even talking about that for the most part on this program. What we're talking about is the society creating doubts and mental anxieties and problems in people who do not have authentic gender dysphoria. We're telling kids that have no history of having any trouble, all of a sudden, announcing to entire classes. You don't take a student out of you don't have a student in a class who's exhibiting issues and then dealing with that student. No, you announce to the entire class, boys are not real, girls are not real. You tell an entire class you're not real. What are we doing? Now, as it turns out, this is not just, me say. I have said that anybody with a set of eyes can just, using their own common sense, tell the difference. Well, the science backs that up. Now, it used to be, and there's a study that just came out, and it used to be that geneticists thought that there was maybe one gene in the chromosome. I guess humans have 27 chromosomes, and they identified that they thought it was one gene. I think they call it this SRY gene, whatever, that differentiated, that made the distinction and set everything else in motion. There are 20,000 genes in the human body, and because of our technological advances in being able to analyze DNA and so forth, people are able to map things to such a degree that somebody took a look. I think they examined like 500 different people, and 53 different tissue samples. So you've got, and I think this was performed on cadavers, but whatever. But 53 different parts of the body, 500 different subjects, and identified these 20,000 genes. Mapped this out. And so it was a reliable study. And before I cut to the answer, I'm going to turn to a woman. Her name was Jenny Graves. She's a professor of genetics at La Trobe University. Anyways, she had speculated that there might be perhaps as many as several hundred genes that are different in men and women. She was surprised by the result of this study when it came out. She was wrong. There's not several hundred. As I say, used to think maybe only one. She speculated, no, it's much higher than that. Then the study came out, much higher still, 6,500. A third of the genes in the human body a third of those genes operate differently, depending on whether they're a man or a woman. Now, what are we talking about? Well, because your genes direct the production of proteins. And so these genes, these 20,000 genes, aren't just something that, they're there in your DNA when you're born and they set some. No, they operate through your life and they regulate the production of the proteins in your body throughout your life. Things like your skin, your muscles, your heart, your brain. And there are genes that operate and produce different proteins in those different parts of the body, 6,500 of them, a third. There is, and if you have an operation and remove certain parts, or if you take hormones to infuse a different kind of a drug into your body, guess what? It doesn't change those genes. They're still there. So when that little sixth grade boy says, no, he's a boy, he's got some science to back him up.
I think absolutely that's the case. And I think for all of us, and for me, I again, being confused as a young man as to what was going on and what I was feeling as times changed, I still get to the point that, boy, this whole thing is confusing. And yes, there are differences between men and women. There are phenomenal differences. For me, it's a wonderful thing. I am so thrilled to death that there are differences between men and women. It's a wonderful thing. And for me, God produced this beautiful chemistry that can go on between two people that really have consequential differences. And those two differences come to bring out the best in both of us if we play those cards right, if we do it the right way, and if we follow God, if we follow His pattern. If we don't follow His pattern, it certainly can go haywire, and we know that there's a lot of that. But for me, if we follow those, we can all become just better people. So as a male, yes, I'm a male. Are there wonderful genes in a woman? Heck yes. I'm thrilled to death in those differences, and it can help me become a better person. It can help me learn. I'm a bit of an analytical guy. I use my mind all the time. My mind is very sharp, and God blessed me with that. And I don't have enough of an understanding of my emotions and the way I feel. Yet if I'm around women, they consequentially help me along those lines to understand that a little bit better. They feel that different, and that's good. That allows me to understand a little bit more how other people are thinking rather than try to do my own analysis as to what's going on. I tend to get a feel for that. And so it makes all the sense to me. I had not heard these numbers, but that sure makes all the sense in the world to me that we are truly males or females throughout our body. That makes a big difference. And again, it's a pretty simple thought that if I make a tuck here or a snip here, I can become a different person. That truly is not the case.
Yeah, this study was done by a group called Biomed Central, came out in 2017. The professors leading the study was Moran Gushoni and Shmuel Petrovsky. Anyways, BMC Biology, Biomed Central, the landscape of sexual, forget that, I'm not going to pronounce the some of these scientific terms, but basically if anybody's interested and you were to Google Biomed Central and 6,500 genes, men and women, I'm sure you'd find this. But there's not just one study, not just one. Well, the funny thing about truth is it'll keep coming up. Some other folks did a study. This was done by the Hudson Institute of Medical Research out of Melbourne, Australia. And they collaborated with, actually, the Monash Gender Clinic close by at the University of Missouri. In any event, they identified several different genes, 12 different genes. They studied 380 transgender women, meaning men who were transitioning to being female. And they found 12 different genes that were significantly overrepresented in those women compared to non-transgender men. And basically what that means is that these handful of genes are involved in they're connected in terms of the way the hormones, estrogen and androgen, are handled in these particular, in all people. And they found that those genes were different in these particular people. So the hormones were treated differently. And so basically what they did is they came up with basically a scientific explanation for why people have these gender issues, why they feel the way they do. And why is that important? Well, the reason why that is important, that's not the cultural narrative. The cultural narrative is that our ideas of male and female are created by societal stereotypes. We create this. So therefore, we can change this. And if you have science telling you, well, no, you can't change it. It's not just a matter of changing how you think. There are these genes, well, that creates a problem with the narrative. And that set off alarm bells. Article in TheGuardian.com. Bringing genetics into trans identity is a terrifying path. So they quoted some guy who's another professor who said basically this particular study doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove any causality. It's just an association. Well, okay, maybe it hasn't been proved yet, but maybe the direct link hasn't been proved. But you know what? It provides probably a roadmap for taking that further and perhaps proving that. But in any event, the words that were used by the author of this particular article was that this sort of approach to it's terrifying. It's the rise of fascism and hate. It's incredibly dangerous. And this kind of research can be weaponized. This is the terminology that is used to describe a scientific study just dealing with objective facts.
Well, one of the things, Ray, that I think we always want to do is, at least I do, is trust that God has put the things in place. Science is a wonderful thing. It allows us to look at things in a way that's factual. And in this case, we need to understand and look at that. It's not fascist to do science. It's not fascist to understand. What is telling somebody else what their opinion should be. But in order to allow science to tell us what is and what isn't is absolutely correct. We live in this world. We live in this physical world where there's water and there's ice and there's water vapor. And if we try to decide that it's wrong because some of the water vapor doesn't want to be vapor, it wants to be water, we can dance around that for a long time. But when the temperature gets too hot, things go ahead and they vaporize. And therefore, what we need to do is understand what is the science, allow it to tell us, and look at it with open eyes. Not with blinders on so that it proves our point, but with God's truth that it proves what God has put here on earth and what we, as humans that live on this earth, should try to understand. You just don't get to start skewing the facts and pushing them around because they're different than what you think. What you have to do is understand that and put that into the theory. One of the things that happens as a scientist is the scientific method. And the scientific method says, look at the data, then formulate the hypothesis. Then bring that to other people and allow that hypothesis to be moved based on where they're at. But it doesn't say you get to go ahead and skew the data in order to break your hypothesis one way or the other. The data is as is. It will come to tell us that.
No, well, that's, I'm sorry, you're talking like a scientist. And you clearly don't understand because, the reason this is terrifying, why should science be terrifying? I thought, and I'm not a scientist by training, but, when I was taught about science, when I was back in high school and so forth, is that the scientific method was an objective way of you test your hypothesis, you come up with a hypothesis, but then you check it against the data,
right,
and you see where it goes. And as a lawyer, you're doing the same thing. When you have a trial, you're looking for the truth, and you look at the evidence and you weigh it. This piece of evidence versus another. Where does the truth lie? And you have to do that fairly and with an open mind. And when you've built up an answer already in your head, and you've determined that that's it, and you've invested a lot of emotional capital into that, when the science doesn't bear you out, that's terrifying. That's terrifying to some people. So anyways, let's recap. So we have a little boy stating the obvious, at least in terms of what people can see with their eyes, saying something that is in line with what people have believed for millennia, being punished and ostracized for this. And then we have science backing him up. And by the way, this opinion that this boy expressed happens to be in line with religious beliefs. And he's ostracized. And the science backs up the boy, and it backs up, or starting to anyways, maybe we'll have more of it, and I'm sure there will be more studies on this, but the science backs up this little boy and these religious beliefs. And this isn't even a religious belief. I mean, I don't think this boy was speaking out of some kind of, religious, doctrine or some kind of, desire to, evangelize some particular religious faith or whatever. He said, no, he's a boy. But it backs up this child. It backs up common sense, science, common sense, religion. They're reinforcing one another. We're finding the same answer in all of them, but people find this whole scenario terrifying. So why is that? Well, there's a mindset that is kind of current in our society and our culture, and we see it in our upcoming presidential election. We have a number of candidates who are speaking openly about socialism, and they're proclaiming that it's a good thing, and that perhaps the United States should move more in the direction of socialism. Now, what in the world does this have to do with what we're talking about? Well, surprisingly, a good bit. There's a reason why, socialism and communism, they had the same philosophical underpinnings. There's a reason why Marx and Engels thought that religion had to be suppressed, that it had to be, in fact, done away with. And there's a reason why the Soviet Union, when they adopted their form of communism, really suppressed it. There's a reason why it is now outlawed in communist China. And it's because the philosophical underpinnings for socialism, communism, the thing they have in common is what we talked about that we found in the writing of St. Paul at the beginning of this program, which is a respect and a belief in the individual. And it's the reason why, and it also has been up till now, basically a guiding principle of our system that we've used to organize our society here in this country. The whole Bill of Rights, all of it, the respect for the individual. Well, socialism believes that the individual has to subordinate him or herself to the collective. There is the group, and it's the group that matters. There's a gentleman by the name of William Lind, and he's written on this, and he talks about political correctness. And did you know that the term political correctness is actually a term that was used, it's a formal term used by communists. And he traces the roots of political correctness to before World War I. And the problem he cites in World War I is that they thought that when, based on the 19th century beliefs of Marx and Engels and so forth, that when and if the world would ever be engaged in a massive conflict, that the workers would rise up and revolt and overthrow the establishment. But that didn't happen in World War I. The long-awaited general upheaval came, but the result didn't match the expectations. What to do? So folks like Antonio Gramsci in Italy and George Lukács in Hungary, they came up with an answer. And according to Mr. Lind, the answer they came up with was because the workers had been blinded. They couldn't see what they should have done. Why couldn't they see? Because they were blinded by, according to these gentlemen, the Christian religion. Why the Christian religion? Because the Christian religion has this belief in the value of the individual. And that is directly opposed to the idea of the collective. And so, the problem with the collective, who decides what the values of the collective are supposed to be? And that's why individuality is in concert with human nature, because the direction of a society is naturally going to go through vicissitudes and bounces up and down based on the argument, based on people expressing all their own views, and who knows what's right, but let's just let that play out and see where it goes. That's the only fair thing to do. Well, certain people don't want that. And that's why when you stray from what is politically correct, you end up like this little boy in the 6th grade, and you are punished. And so in any event, that is, those are, that's how you can trace some of this. And Mr. Lind's argument is basically that you're flying when you put forth this collective philosophy where the individual, if he strays from the proper path, when he dares to exercise his rights of free speech, he needs to be punished. That's why you have this book. That's why you have this political correctness. That's why it's so disturbing when somebody says something that is out of the mainstream, or when science comes up with an answer you don't want to hear, because it's upsetting to this whole structure that you set up. And that's a dangerous position to be in, to set up a structure and then insist everybody follow it, and then find out, whoops.
Well, one of the things I worry about is if we do that, that's how we end up in very serious trouble. I know many years ago we used to believe that if you drop two objects, as a teacher of physics and chemistry and mathematics, there was a dark period where we believed, set forth by Aristotle, that if you drop something like a bowling ball and you drop something like a baseball, the bowling ball itself would obviously go faster because it's heavier and gravity would pull on it harder. And yet as scientists began to come through and show by dropping two balls of very different weight that there was the same speed that they would drop and they would hit the ground at the same time, they were called heretics and they were told that there was something wrong with the objects with which they were dropping. The fact of the matter is we have to bring science into this. We have to understand and allow, and we have to have individuals to believe differently than others, but then you go out and you prove that, and you let the science show the answer. Each of us has many, many beliefs, but we have to let that happen. And it's my belief, one of those, that eventually God's truth will show up, that his facts will be there, that we will find the kind of data, Ray, that you've put forward that shows all these different genes that show the wonderful difference between men and women, all the differences in the world that show that there really is a true, wonderful difference. And for me, it's a wonderful one that allows children to be born, and it allows us to do the right thing because we're not just listening to ourselves, we're listening to others, we're feeling it in our mind and our heart and coming to the true answer. And we have to let that happen. We cannot get to a point where it's forced down our throats, or we really are charging down the wrong path quickly.
So there's a name that a lot of people will be familiar with. His name is Jordan Peterson. He's become kind of famous lately. He's a psychologist and a university professor up in Canada. And a lot of people like what he says, and he's becoming very popular. And apparently one of the preliminary issues that caused him to gain some fame was his refusal to use pronouns like Z and Zer. There are people who they don't want to be called a him or her. This is the battle of the pronouns. They don't want to be called a him or her, but they're kind of a little bit of both. So call me a Z or a Zer. And he's like, no. No. And, okay, fine. You want to consider yourself that way? Fine. You're free to do that. But you're not free to tell me what I can say. And people say, oh, you're offending me if you call me that. And that's a way of imposing a language code. You have, and the control of language is the control of thought. It was Benjamin Franklin who said, again, these principles, we're talking religious principles that happen to coincide with, the principles that have guided our country. So the risk here is if in fact these principles established by guys who came up with what everybody seems to think was a good form of government. It's lasted 200 years. It's provided a place where people from all around the world want to come. And it happens to coincide. They didn't design a society based on a particular religious set of beliefs, but they designed a society based on what they could observe as what was good or bad, just in terms of their own use of human reason for a good form of government. And that happens to coincide with things we find in the writings of St. Paul. And now, potentially, we're going to abandon those. Well, if, the use of simple non-religious human reason coincides with religious faith, if we depart from that, there's a risk that we're really following something that is not the truth. Anyways, to quote Benjamin Franklin, he said, without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. And he said that in 1722. So freedom of speech was linked to freedom of thought. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty. You can't have this freedom to think publicly without freedom of speech. If we are going to be wise as a society, we have to honor the ability of people to speak what they say, even if you're a sixth grade boy who happens to say, no, this guy is a boy, because I'm looking at him and how radical and how outrageous a thing to say. But anyways, so that's what's at stake here. And Peterson, of course, he said, no, what you're doing is you're trying to control my speech. And if you try to control people's speech, you try to control thought. And he's like, no, stop. And, up in Canada, they had this, what they call the Ontario Human Rights Code. And they, I don't know if they passed it or they're considering passing legislation that would make the use of improper speech to be a violation of law for which you could be criminally punished. This is the direction where these things go. This is socialistic thought coming into countries like the U.S. and Canada. This is perhaps the beginnings of what people experienced under Soviet-style communism, where you couldn't say the wrong thing. And if you did say the wrong thing, you get thrown in jail. And people say, oh, no, we're not talking about that here. But aren't we? Aren't we? You know, this is just freedom.
Well, let me add that for me, language is a particularly difficult thing. It's hard. It's not easy to do. It's a tough thing that we use for communication. And to shut things down and not allow us to use particular verbs, particular words, particular pronouns seems like a travesty. To me, I think it's very difficult to understand and to communicate. And if we start having a code that's acceptable and not acceptable in the words that we use, we will shut down the thought. I don't know for you, Ray, but as I grew as a young man, one of the things I really loved to do was to be able to have an open conversation with friends where we could banter about our opinions. And that's when I began to understand what I truly believed. It didn't take heart until I was actually able to express that to someone else and say, yes, that truly makes sense, or no, it did not, as I was bringing that forth. If now we're not allowed to even communicate what we feel, to understand where we're at and where we're not, what a travesty of justice that's got to be. We all have to be able to use these words that we've been given to express ourselves, to learn, and to really discover what truth is. Shut the door to the language we use, and all of a sudden we won't be able to follow those truths. We won't be able to find them. We won't be able to find this wonderful world that God has set up for us and to be able to go out and look at and understand.
You know, there's what occurs to me is we can talk about the science. We can talk about political philosophies. We can talk about the founding fathers of our country and so on and so forth, and look at things from all these different angles. I like to look at things from different angles, because if I look at things from different angles and come up with the same answer, to me it's like, okay, now I'm probably going in the right direction. And so we can look at this one issue from these different angles and come up with the same thing. But basically what we're talking about is where we started with St. Paul. You know, he talked about being courageous, but he talked about maintaining your faith. Think about something. Think about the gospel. Think about your faith. And if you agree with it, hold on to it. But that requires. I mean, he doesn't say, okay, well, everybody, take a vote on whether or not, Christ is real and whether you should believe him or not. If that had happened in the Roman Empire, everybody would have just succumbed to, the norm established by the Roman Empire that Christianity was some superstitious, gobbledygook. But no, those individuals maintained it, and so all we're talking about is freedom. What you're talking about, in essence, is really love. Because, the Catholic Church has this idea of free will. And why is that? It comes from love. God allows us to choose to love him or not, or, to do whatever we want with our particular lives. Why? Because he loves. A parent, when they have to let go of their child, I've got a child that's going to be going off to college in a few days. You have to let go. You have to let them be who they want, who they're. You can't just simply say, "You do this." That's not love. And so, God loves us. There is a God. He loves us, and He's given us this free will. And then when we, as humans, try to establish these structures that push against that and push people down and tell them they can't be individuals. We're going against human nature, whether you can find it in the genes or, we're going against the human condition. It's fundamentally at odds with who we are. And so then the question is, so what do we do? What do we do? And I think for all of us, it's still that letter from St. Paul. Be courageous. Proclaim the ministry. Proclaim the truth. Maybe, we can utilize science to bolster and support and reaffirm, those truths, but stand for the truth. And I think that's what that's what we have to do. That's a challenge today. There is so much out there today that's telling us, no, you have to believe this, you have to believe that. We're making up truths and then telling everybody they have to follow them. That just can't work. And even if you can control the language and succeed in telling people, okay, you have to use these words, and they use those words for fear of the consequences, the fact of the matter is, all you're going to do is suppress their thought. The human condition is that of free spirits, free souls, free individuals, and all you're going to do is put that underneath, and then it's going to boil up at some point. Isn't it better to simply allow people to speak freely? We've thought that for a long time. Now a lot of people are trying to tell us we shouldn't do that.
You've always got to allow folks to have that opportunity to express themselves in a way that they feel. And then we can listen to what they say, and then we get to choose one way or the other. Why? Because just what you said, we have that freedom. We have that ability from God to choose. And that will come out. That will sort out. To close off, to hide, to tell people what they can say and what they can think and what they can believe has to be absolutely wrong. How does it feel when you're in a room and you're told what you're going to think or do, and in your heart it's wrong? It shuts you down. It feels like you're being put in prison. Whereas when you're allowed to express your feelings back and forth and choose for yourself, somehow that feels intrinsically right. And we've got to allow people to do that. We've got to allow them to call a boy a boy. We've got to allow them to call a girl, and we've got to allow us to be able to express ourselves. When we get to the point where we are suppressing our language or our thoughts, we are in deep trouble. We have got to be able to be allowed to think and to be different and to argue and to allow that whole process to come out. Think about a courtroom. What a wonderful place. Two people thinking absolutely opposite ideas, presenting that to a group of people to try to understand what is the truth and what is the real outcome. What a brilliant situation was put together for us, and we get to allow that to happen. You don't stop one side from saying what their belief is. You allow them to do that, and then it's decided which way is going to go.
I heard a presentation the other night about an interesting group. Here in St. Louis, it's called, this group calls itself by the name Touchy Topics Tuesday. And they bring together people on Tuesday mornings in a coffee house to just discuss race. And you've got white people and black people here in St. Louis discussing, and it came after the Ferguson incident, and that's how it started. And often enough, they just, people talk about meetings that are contentious and people get upset. But through it all, people end up respecting the other person more, learning to see things from the other person's point of view more. I mean, you talked about, the complementarity between men and women, and they help you, see things from a different angle and so forth. This is the same principle. It's freedom. We're talking about the benefits of freedom. There's a lot in our society today where we're going against the will of God, whether it be contraception, abortion, so many things. God decides things, and we decide something else. God gave us freedom. We decide it's supposed to be suppressed. This is going against the reality that has been established by God. So, anyway, we could continue talking about this, but it is time to wrap this up. This has been St. Paul's Letters to America. I want to thank my friend Bob Hennekeys for being with us today. It's been my pleasure to have him, and I hope he joins us again.
Thank you, Ray, for having me and allowing me to be with you, to understand just a little bit more who God is and the wonder that he brings us, because it is truly, absolutely love.
And so with that, we'll close up for today. We hope this has been helpful. We hope this has allowed you to perhaps think of some things in a different light. We thank you for joining us. Hope you'll join us again. Until the next time, God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.